So I did that, and I thought it would be a nice way to start this talk because it incorporates the three things which I think Transmediale is pretty much about this year, and that is networking through pipe systems, planets, and seemingly outdated or at least misplaced kind of media. And now when I say misplaced, it's because I'm not sure exactly what this is, if this is comics, if this is not comics. I wouldn't normally show this in this form. If maybe I would show this through an app, through the post-print era, but it was fitting on stage. But this topic about if this is or isn't comics is actually a good gateway to the first declaration that I must make before we start. Comics, I don't like comics. I mean, I really don't like comics. Raise your hands who here likes comics. You're wrong. No, you're wrong. You cannot like comics today. It is physically impossible to like comics the way that we think of liking today because comics does not have a like button. And that is the truth. You can upload a comic and then, I don't know, like it, but then you will actually be memeing it, and then the content of the meme would be a comic, but it is not actually comics. I could also say that I'm not too big a fan of traditional comics. I think some of them aren't that well written in my personal opinion. Then why is this schmuck actually lecturing to us today? Because I like something which I think is a bit broader than comics, and that is sequential art. So what's the difference between comics and sequential art in my point of view? Well, I think basically comics has the word comic inside of it. We've grown to think about it as this low-tech print-based form of children/geek entertainment or political satire. It's a very print-based kind of art form, whereas sequential art is a broader term. It was coined originally in the 80s by Will Eisner, and then further elaborated by Scott McCloud in the early 90s, and he says that sequential art basically is juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence. And if you think about artwork spanning through history, you would find sequential art or stuff that actually answers to this definition of sequential art in antiquity, for instance, in Egypt, further on down the line, also in Christian Europe. Well, it remained Christian up to this day, I guess, but it was much more Christian back then. And when they would make illustrated Bible stories for illiterate people, they used this aesthetic that looked kind of like comics. And if you look at this scroll right here, this is eventually what turned into the word balloon. So this is all forms of sequential art, at least the way that I like to think about this. And then it poses another interesting thought that maybe, well, first of all, maybe comics is not a medium but a genre inside sequential art. And many scholars and other people such as McCloud might disagree with me on this one. I would say that sequential art is not exactly a medium because it is not technology based. You don't need, like in photography, the technology of producing a photograph through capturing light and material in order to create sequential art. It's not like cinema, where you actually need this machine that projects light onto a screen and can actually capture motion. You can pretty much, apply sequential art to reading to various media. So I would say it is a meta-medium, and I would say you could use it wisely as a tool for examination of sequentiality in all media. How you do that? By translating all sensory aspects of a process, and I include sound, motion, and image, and today I include sound because I think that a lot of the sound that we hear today is iconic sound, which is also sequence-based and coded. And you take all this into a symbolic, mainly visual, again, reading. Now what we're going to try and do today is trying to understand the logic of comics vis-a-vis social media. And another interesting key factor that we need to take into consideration when we discuss also social media is that comics is infographic maps set in time. Now that last word, time, is what makes it different than normal infographics. Infographics, for instance, a map, or when I want to, you know, build a complicated IKEA piece of furniture, I need an infographic brochure which explains how to do things. But in comics, the concept of time, how long it will take me to build up that shelf, comes into consideration. For instance, if I have this strip with 10 images of a cigarette, how much time does it take me to see this strip? I would say half a second. How much time am I actually seeing here? I would say 5 minutes. That's about the time that it would take a cigarette to decay. So if I'm going like this from one corner to the other side of the room, right now I'm actually walking through 5 minutes of time. These ideas are not new. They're by Scott McCloud, but I'm just going over them once more. And this is a very, very crucial understanding of how comics works, because here you see the same cigarette, and it pretty much encapsulates the time frame of the scene. And it's all over the scene, at the top, at the bottom, and through this we understand how much time passed in order to tell this specific bit of information. The thing is that if you look at stuff that Chris Ware does, you can go much, 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 much further and elaborate on, you know, just the conception of and perception of space through sequential art. And this is where I stop calling comics comics and start thinking about it more as sequential logic, sequential analysis, and understanding of our environment, or just sequential art and onwards. And by that, I would say all art is sequential. When I look at a picture, it is not necessarily static because I have a sequential relation to it. I look at the Mona Lisa, I know where the Mona Lisa came from, I knew who drew it, I know how I came to the Louvre, I have this entire story of the nightmarish flight that I had on my way to Paris, and this interacts with my understanding of that picture. Sequence is all over this understanding of that single image. There is no static image, there is no static image stuck in time. Everything is sequential. All art is sequential, or actually any media. In other words, everything is somewhat sequential. We could at least agree on that. So again, why comics? If sequential art is so broad, if I could expand it and expand it and expand it into anything, why am I nagging you with talks about comics? Well, I think that basically today, comics is, you know, making a major, major comeback. And if you don't agree with me, well, maybe a nice way to tell the story is through the story of how two tech geeks used comics to take over the world. Not those two tech geeks. Those two tech geeks. Now what I mean by that is that I don't really know if Gates and Jobs were actually prolific comic book readers, but they were kind of geeky, so I assumed that they were. But if you think about the interfaces that they presented through Windows and through the Apple interfaces, which pretty much govern today applications such as, you know, applications in general, and Facebook, YouTube, and the likes, they're all based on what I find very, very similar to comics logic, and it's pretty much taken over. A good way to think about this is that back in the 80s and the early 90s, there were two splits on this perception of where we're going with this thing called the World Wide Web. There was the California mindset, in which they envisioned this virtual reality, parallel universe stuff flying around and you touching them, and all those Matrix, Lawnmower Man kind of films that we grew up on, or at least I grew up on, or, you know, Back to the Future, Marty McFly standing in 2015 on the street with a huge three-dimensional shark threatening to swallow him whole. But coincidentally, it does not look like this today, because there was another mindset in Europe, for instance in Berlin, which derived from a very, very different kind of settings. They didn't have that much money, like in Silicon Valley, and they just had loads of computers that they tried to connect together with bubblegum, hot wire, or whatever they could find. And that formed this concept of the digital cities, which we've heard about earlier in the conference through Clemens's panel. And generally, Google kind of like took the logic of these two things together. But what you would need in order to make all these computers talk to one another is some kind of a two-dimensional interface, which would be easy to use and easy to access in order to, you know, run the damn thing. So it's not surprisingly that today's website or Facebook page is very similar to a newspaper. God, how we've evolved. Quite embarrassing. But anyway, the whole thing is very, very interesting in respect to comics when you start thinking about the difference still between print-based or old media-based news or platforms in opposition to online media and online social media. And the main difference is that online social media is not linear. For one, I mean, you don't read a text from top to bottom. You can pretty much, you know, decide where you're going with it. It's responsive, but more to it, the images inside the comics, basically, or inside, sorry, the images inside the Facebook page are pretty much like a comics. It's infographics, images and text interconnected one with the other. Each one signifies a certain kind of meaning, reflecting onto another. And in order to get a clear reading of what you want, you kind of have to decipher this logic, just like you would have to do with a comic book. You have to like make a certain kind of effort trying to understand what is the template that the creator is trying to present here in order to understand what's going on. And that's exactly when comic books and comics logic steps in majorly, in my opinion. And it's not a coincidence that in apps today, the aesthetics of comics are predominant. I mean, you see them all the time in apps communicating in order to see, you know, who's talking to who. You have these word balloons. And also, if you look at more contemporary comics, this looks like, to me, very, very resemblant of a chat. I mean, you don't actually see them talking. There's no actual word balloons, just like you would have in a chat. You just, you know, it goes from up and to bottom, top to bottom, and this represents one side, this represents another side. So the connection, to me, is abundantly clear. So let's assume that you're buying into what I'm trying to convince you of right now. Let's try and play with this. Let's try and better understand this, because to me it's a very, very, very clear notion. I've been thinking about this for quite some time, but then I started thinking, wait, if this reality that we're living in or mediating through is a kind of comics, then what kind of comics is this? And if this comics has taken over our space, what kind of space are we living in today? Now, a good way to start this from is from something that James Brittle said in the Lift 12 conference. And the original plan was to invite James here to talk. Didn't work out, but at least I have the honor of quoting him. He's the same guy that came up with the concept of the new aesthetic. And on literature, he said, space is a very bad metaphor for the internet. We used cyberspace for a while, but actually it's not a good way to think about it. The internet is not a space. It's like a whole other dimension. And I remember hearing that for the first time, and I thought, bada bing. There's something really interesting about this notion, though it is really still very, very problematic because it poses the million-dollar question, or maybe the Google dollar question, which is, what the fuck is space? I mean, what is this thing? I mean, I think Brittle is actually referring to physical space, because he says you can't be inside the internet. Physically, it's not virtual reality, but there are other kinds of space. For instance, a board game could be a certain kind of space that you interact with, and you just need to apply certain kind of rules according to the rules of the game, and then you interact inside this certain kind of space. There are many, many definitions, philosophical definitions of space today. But maybe what Brill is actually trying to say is that we need to think about our approach towards space. There are different approaches towards space, and virtual reality approach is not the right one for social media. So I thought, I would put my 2 cents in to what Bridal was saying and maybe suggest that mainstream internet is a set of potential narrative platforms. That's our approach to that cyberspace. We approach to it as a potential narrative platform. And then I would turn my 2 cents into 50 cents and elaborate and say that it's an interconnected template designed to engage us in potential sequential storytelling which intersect with our spatial conduct and alter it. So then comes the second Google dollar question: what the fuck is a narrative? And this is a very, very big question, because what I'm saying is basically, if online media is just us narrating and making stories all the time, it's just a big fucking story, then basically I'm saying that the life is a story. Everything is a narrative. I mean, where does, where do you draw the line between just experience and narrating? Because the more conservative mindset would say, wait a minute, a narrative needs a narrator. It needs one author, one deliberate, intentional author that wanted to tell me a certain kind of story. Wrong. Then come the structuralists and say, no, the poet, that guy, he's dead. You do not need him. Narratives can exist without a narrator. Best way to think about it, for instance, our most canonic text, the Bible, the Old Testament. I have no idea how many people wrote that piece of text out of how many scriptures it was compiled together. And at the same time, we don't really care. We still, maybe this being called God created it, or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. The text exists, and we still, follow what's written in it. Well, some of us do. But actually, you don't even need an actual text. You can have narratives which are not text originated. For instance, if we go back to my favorite topic of my country, you have the Zionist narrative of the emancipation of the Israeli people and constitution of the Israeli state. And then in opposition, you have the Palestinian narrative of the Nakba and the occupation. That's not written in one single source. There's no one source where this is written. Oh yeah, you want to know about that? Go read that book. It does not exist. It's just not. But still, we know that the narrative exists, because the narrative is a chain of events that we pinpointed out of this abstract, obscure thing called reality, and we, as a group, come to agreement that things have happened in that order. Now, in online social media, this is pretty much how our Facebook timeline looks like. It's this pinpointing of occasions that pretty much created what we remember, or what we show is our life. And this is a very, very exciting idea, because as opposed to other narratives or more abstract narratives, social media actually allows you to record your narrating, to actually have a trace of it, to flip through its pages, to flip through the pages of your life's comic book. And this is a very, very interesting approach toward space. Let's try and analyze that and see what we can learn about ourselves if our lives have become this comic book. So the first thing I would like to do is start from what Scott McCloud did. He presented 6 forms of transitioning: the moment to moment, action to action, subject to subject, scene to scene, aspect to aspect. We'll not get into it, but I will show examples of it. And then there's this 6 non sequitur transition, which, in his opinion, it's this transition where nothing makes sense. For instance, if I show you a picture of a cucumber and planet Earth, you would not necessarily think that it's a comic. You just think, this makes no sense, there's just 2 images, it's a non sequitur. So it's either a very, very experimental form of comics, or a very, very shitty comic book creator. But how does this work online? So let's try and use this logic online. And for that, we will use the amazingly sequential story of Orit's birthday. I went online and saw it's Orit's birthday. That's me going online. I decided to send her my regards. That would be an action-to-action transition. I'm actually going to act upon it. Then I didn't know what to write, so I went to see what others wrote. That's an aspect-to-aspect transition. Why is it an aspect-to-aspect? Because the main subject is the birthday and different aspects of it, how other people perceived it. On her page, I scroll down to read the timeline of her friends' comments on her birthday. That's a moment-to-moment transition because I'm seeing what everyone chronologically wrote, and I'm also maybe scrolling down. I'm doing something that's really moment-to-moment, time-connected. I also noticed she posted an event on her party, so I checked it out. That's a scene-to-scene transition, meanwhile, in the birthday event. And it's also an aspect-to-aspect transition because the topic is still the birthday. But then something funny happened. I thought about Britney Spears suddenly. What's going on with her today? God, that song reminds me of how there was nothing to do on MTV when I would come back home from school. God, the 90s sucked. This is a non sequitur transition. Why? Because if I were recording my stream and someone, would actually look, he would not understand why I started browsing Britney Spears websites, MTV Today, trying to download 90s compilations and checking out the website of my school or other people who learned it. He would just get lost. He would not be able to follow it. So we could think about this as some kind of a non sequitur transition, or at least one of the non sequitur transitions that we could find online. So let's assume that current viral social media constructs are a living, breathing comics in constant formation. Bear with me on that, right? What problems does it pose? Well, narcissists and psychopaths have this tendency to make everything revolve around their own very rigid understanding, prismatic understanding of reality. They would use other people as tools. They will align everything according to a certain kind of intention or determinism that they see as a certain kind of set of rules or truth. Narcissists would make everyone reflect on them. Everything would be a reflection of themselves. And it is not surprising, if you read Wikipedia on narcissism, that since 2000, on psychological tests designed to detect narcissism, the scores of residents of the United States have continually increased. Psychologists have suggested a link to social networking. Now, a classic example of this, remember quest games? You would go into the haunted house, and you would need that key to the chest, because there would be, like, I don't know, a treasure. And you're, prancing around with your very degraded 3D graphics at the time, and at the other side of the screen there would be this midget with a funny looking face and hat, and he's the only one around, so I'm just gonna go to that midget. And I'm engaging him in conversation, and he tips me and he tells me where the key to the treasure chest is, and then I say thank you, goodbye, and I turn my back, and I never see that guy again. He stops existing. That's pretty much how we use chats today. I wasn't sure if to go or not. I checked, and I saw my friend Alma was invited too, but hasn't yet confirmed. I saw she was online, so I wrote to Alma and turned her into an active character in my story. And the chat went something like, hey, are you going to Orit's party? I hate that bitch, but I'll come anyway. Oh yeah, me too. So let's go together, then keep each other company. Sure, okay. Then I clicked her, she disappeared. I didn't know if she was in the bathroom while she was texting this to me, on Mount Everest, on the moon, right next door. Today she might be typing, just sitting a chair next to me, but I just wouldn't notice that she was there because I was just too busy with my Facebook account. So that's a troubling aspect that we can conclude. For instance, I'm a very pessimistic guy. I thrive on pessimism. It makes for really, really awesome stories. But let's try and think outside the box, a bit broader about this concept of, the comics model, or really the apparatus beyond comics, in opposition to sequential web logic. And when I say comics, in this case, I will also be talking generally about literature. And in literature and comics, you would have an author and a public, or an author and a market. You would have an editor to which You bring your work in order to introduce it to the author in the market, and you would have a marketplace which pretty much sets the rules of the game for you. How does this work with sequential web logic? Well, for starters, you do not have an author and a market anymore. We have users. And we've come to an understanding that users today are not necessarily private users. It's not just you and me and what we want to get. It could be also corporate users using our information, turning us into algorithms. And what's more, it can also be web bots. These programs which do not actually exist, but they're programmed to mimic human talk, and they're also interested in the information that we are giving them, and then they move that onward to power whores. And aside from that, they're also creators of content because they're actually writing us stuff that we communicate with. So structuralists would be very, very happy with this because this proves abundantly that the narrator is dead. There is no dichotomy between the creator of the media and the recipient of the media. We are definitely in this post-medial stage right now. That's a major difference. What happens with the editor? I would say in a normal democratic, so to speak, industry, the editor comes after the author went a certain distance, and he tells them, I'm interested in your work, but maybe you should highlight this part, this will not work. The worst case, he would say, not for me. That's the worst kind of censorship that he could give you. Online, you have other kinds of editors that work more tyrannically. You have the platform and the search engine. What do I mean? I mean that they edit you and censor you a priori beforehand. You can only narrate with the information that the platform is showing you on your feed. When you search for something, you can only use the stuff that appears in the search engine. So basically, these editors edit you before, without you even knowing that you were edited. That's some of the stuff that people are talking about when they're discussing the centralized nature of today's social media, but maybe it doesn't even have to be centralized. It's just the fact that you are not aware of how it works that really makes it threatening on, the power that you actually might have or not have. Last is the marketplace. Why did I put the template side by side the marketplace? The marketplace places the rules that you can use in order to, try and sell the book. That's where the editor would go with your book, trying to sell it. The template pretty much also poses the rules that you could work with in order to create an effect on the information. You can only do what the template lets you do. On Facebook, we can only like, share, post, comment, maybe repost. This is a very, very rigid, not so free form of conduct in free space. You can't scratch your nose on Facebook. Now, maybe this is second nature, maybe this is clear to all of us, but I think it should be stressed out because if we don't understand these things, we don't understand how dependent we've become on them. If we go into this whole template talk, let's try and look at two kinds of template. The comics template is a static template, the old comics template, whereas the sequential WebLogic template is a responsive template. And let's see what happens there and the way comics logic works there on the responsive template in opposition to the static template. Now in comics, the content and the framework are very, very well connected. Right now you're looking at two abstract squares. If I were to tell you that these are actually two panels with a gutter in the middle and there was a cow here which ate all the grass and left or something like that, you wouldn't necessarily believe me too quickly. You would need some kind of content to prove it. Otherwise, it could be an abstraction of two windows or two boxes being shipped to America around the time of 9/11. But when it comes to abstraction and framework online, is there anyone who has a doubt on what this is? Is there anyone who doesn't know what this abstract shape is? It is clearly not a really extreme close-up on a black polka dot which has a blue eye and a yellow eye, and in the background is orange because she's sitting on a huge orange. It's just not viable. You would never believe that. You know that this is a player. You know that this, basically what this abstract shape, which does not need the content it doesn't need the content in order to promise you that something is going to happen. It promises you a transition. It promises you entertainment. It promises you content without actually giving you content. Even if you were sent to another page, you would still expect it to do something. And it's the fact that it does something that counts. Now, in comics, this will not work. If I have a comic book and I have 6 frames and I try to read this and make sense of it, but then suddenly I introduce a non sequitur frame. At first it makes kind of sense. Maybe this happened before, maybe this happened after. Then I introduce more non sequitur transitions, more transitions. It makes for a really, really bizarre comic book, which I can't read. Eventually I would just start thinking, what the fuck is 50 Cent doing in my comic book? Now I think of 50 Cent as a non sequitur transition. I have no idea what kind of sequence in our culture happened that put this guy in the media. He's just a really bad rapper. But if you go to sequential art and to social media, you can put as many non sequitur transitions as you would like. Let's assume that I wanted to go and see Breaking Bad online because it's free. I start going and I find my way, and I pretty much learned how to, read through because I know the alphabet, and then bang, non sequitur transition. It's a pop-up, but I know I need to close it and not engage in that. Keep going, all of a sudden there's this little button that I know not to press, because if I press that, it will download that thing that I know I don't want on my computer, because we've had very, very bad experience with that. So I just keep going, another non sequitur transition, and I just keep going. I know I don't want that. I know I don't want that. I think I need to go there. I have my experience. It's not that picture. If you click that picture, nothing will happen. You should go there. I'm just gonna keep going. Then there's like loads of choices, but I kind of I know I need to prove I'm not a robot. Then I need to wait the 5 seconds. Then I finally reach it, and then when I press play, bada bing, I get a casino advertisement. So I know to wait the 13 seconds. I go after that. I go after this. Finally, I reach the show, and then another casino pop-up, but eventually I'm able to watch Breaking Bad. If you would give this as a sequence to a prolific comic book reader, he would tell you that you are fucked in the head. You're crazy. No one can actually read this. But surprisingly, we are able to do this. We've grown accustomed to the non sequitur. That same transition that Scott McCloud referred to as really bad comics or really experimental stuff that you can't work with, we run our lives, we thrive on the non sequitur transition. Now, okay, great for us. This might be a bit confusing. This might show that stuff is a bit incompatible for us right now, what we want and the way the system works. But it becomes very, very troubling when we start to actually try to affect the place and the space that we live in. And when we try to react, to be activists. Let's say we're political activists who want to affect the world through the World Wide Web, through social media. Now, I love this little meme about how idiots think Facebook works. And I'll just keep that in the background while I elaborate. Let's assume that a left-wing friend of mine posted a very racist right-wing slur on his Facebook wall. And for some reason, I decide to like it. Why am I liking a racist right-wing slur? It makes no sense. Well, for starters, I didn't want to share it. So it's not that I actually liked it. I just thought, I don't share that kind of stuff on my wall because I like it that my wall has, more positive stuff or jokes or whatever. So I'll just like it. But it has nothing to do with actually liking because I don't like the content. Maybe I like the fact that my friend pointed out that content and I think it's important. Or maybe I'm just liking it just so he knows that I know because I couldn't actually press share and I didn't have time to comment. What does liking, actual liking, have to do with the button like? I don't know. It's a non sequitur transition. And it creates a very confusing situation for another reader because he doesn't exactly understand what I make of the information. I mean, I am a living I'm a living panel in this sequence, and he needs to understand my relation to it in order to understand what the information means, but he does not because it is non sequitur. Same thing with a share. What happens when I share this? I decide to share this with the world, and I do it at 3 in the morning, and by the time everyone wakes up, it just disappeared down to the bottom of the scroll bar to the place where posts go to die. It is not a share. I don't know who I shared it with. Maybe someone in China who somehow was my friend on Facebook got it. It's not exactly what you would share when you would actually share something. So it's also a very non sequitur transition. We're not exactly in full awareness of what we're doing. And we're not exactly in full awareness of the power that we have or do not have when we use social media. There's so much commotion online, and still, no matter how activist you try to be, you get another idiot and another idiot that's looking exactly just like him elected for president at the end of the day. So what exactly are we doing? We're not exactly sure if, revolutionary people like Julian Assange today are actually making such a big effect, or maybe it's just a fad. Maybe Julian Assange is a rebel with or without a cause, or maybe he's just a really cool new version of Bono, but with much better looking hair. Pretty bleak, right? But let's try and think about the more positive, or maybe try and end this with a semi-positive, semi-negative note. And for that, let's try and think of future prospects of social media in our culture, which do not include the impending end of the world. Well, for starters, what I would try to do is embrace the non sequitur. Embrace the non sequitur before the non sequitur swallows us whole. This is the non sequitur swallowing us. This is not a racist slur. It's just a coincidence that he's black, but this is kind of like a metaphor to how we live, like, in my opinion, today. But if you think about all these transitions here, all these 5 first transitions are all print-based transitions. And this is actually a really, really good thing, because what that means is that this is an analysis of an old media model, which really had one narrator. And so there was an intentional transitioning. So it's quite probable to assume that instead of shoving everything into the non sequitur box, which doesn't make sense to us, we could finally take these transitions, these non sequitur transitions, and open them up and start analyzing them and really understand the difference between liking and sharing to a much deeper level, and maybe understand the effect. Because the alternative is pretty devastating, in my opinion. We have right now, if you think about it, we have this communist, social-based network that we use, but it's competing with a very capitalist ethos and market that's trying to take over it, right? I mean, that's what happens, right? It's been happening for a couple of years with the music. Now it's happening with downloads, with live streaming. And they're competing on our expense. And what it does is it messes with our heads, and it controls us by means of communication breakdown. And it's pretty similar to what Walter Benjamin said about cinema, that either fascism will take it and use it for propaganda, or the proletarians would, use it in order to represent themselves and, take the revolution one step ahead. We're just making these narcissistic, asocial, rigid reality narratives. We're the proletarian, and we're kind of like playing with ourselves and becoming these very non-social beings. But and the last thing that I would like to leave you with this thought, that it is not only affecting this virtual sphere, this more abstract, imaginary sphere of our conduct, but it is actually disorienting our space, or our approach towards space, physical space. It kind of like melts down the line for us right now with this augmented age of, smartphones and tablets. It melts down the line between abstraction and content. And a good way to think about it is those newborn digital natives, those 2-year-old kids standing in the kitchen in front of a cornflake box, and he's standing in front of that cornflakes box with his fingers on the printed image, and he's going like this, and he's frustrated that it is not zooming in because it is not a touch screen. But to him, it's second nature. He doesn't know exactly where the line is drawn, and we don't exactly know anymore where the line is drawn, and we don't know anymore when we're looking at an abstract, static, contemplating shape, an artwork or something, which means something to someone maybe, or maybe, just maybe, if we understand it correctly, we will find out that what we're actually looking at is a gateway. Thank you.